All right, well, guys, we have an excellent speaker today. I am super excited to hear from my friend. He is a 1981 graduate cum laude of Notre Dame and he spent his early legal career working for the great law firm of King and Spalding. Whoa. So, for those of you who don't know, that is a top notch law firm in the not just Southeast, but nationally. So you guys are in for a treat to hear how David Pashue is going to solve the problem of our national debt that's increasing at like $1 trillion every 100 days. David's got a plan. All right, David, come on. We're excited to hear from you. Thank you.
Thank, thank you, Jeff. It's really nice to hear have a chance to talk about something I've been working on for about 15 years. And it's very interesting that, you guys are the sons of the American Revolution. And as I listened to your pledge, I listened to your dedication to what our founders gave us way back in, well, starting in 1776 and then continuing particularly into 1787 when our Constitution was read. You guys are the people that are responsible for, in many ways, pledged make sure that the principles that we put in place in 1787 with our Constitution are carried forward today. And we see very much today, I can tell you a little bit about this. Jeff mentioned my background. I'm from originally, and I've been here most of my life. I did go off to Notre Dame and spent a little time there. And was in Texas for a couple of years working for a federal judge before I went to King and Spalding. King and Spalding was just a law firm when I was there. It's now very much an institution. It's, I think, the 10th largest law firm in the world that has 18 offices literally on every continent except Antarctica in the world. So, it was a great place to learn how to practice law. I moved back to Rome in 1989 and started with what was then Special Maddox law firm there, and stayed there till 2004 when I went out on my own. When I went out on my own, I've always been involved in politics, but when I went out on my own, I had the chance to do some of the things that I'm going to talk to you about today that deal directly with our American Constitution and what our founders intended and where we've gotten away from it and how we need to get back to it. Before I get to that, though, I want to let you know I'm also the author of a novel that will be published this year, the name of which is The Judas Inquiry. And it's particularly appropriate here at Easter time that novel and that name come to the forefront. It's a very spiritual book. It's a Christian inspirational novel, and I hope you'll pay attention to my Facebook page and other things. Jeff will let you know as that comes out. I think it'll be a real. In fact, it's even being looked at now by a major faith-based studio in LA for possible screenplay. We're looking at talking about. I think it'll be very interesting. If any of you know about or have seen the movie The Shack, or have read the book The Shack, or there's a new book out recently, Theo of Golden. There's another book, Dinner with a Complete Stranger. They all deal with kind of dealing with the God and the afterlife and talking about why and explaining why the bad things happen to good and faithful people. So I hope you'll pay attention to that. I'll give you a little push. I also have some materials I brought with me today that follow up on what I'm going to talk to you about, and you're welcome to take them and learn more about it. As I said, I've always been involved in politics, and if we go back to, after the 1990s, in the 1990s, well, if you really want to go back, want to believe this, when Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan ran against each other, Ronald Reagan was able to defeat him based upon the outrageous deficit we ran that year in that last year of Carter's administration. If you ready for this? $1 billion. That was considered outrageous. Our deficit is more than $80 billion every day now. Okay. But Ronald Reagan was able to use that. That's how far down we've come. And I was very interested very concerned about our deficit as far back as that. We move forward and we see in the 90s with Clinton and Newt how they did work together, and they keep telling us how they balanced the budget for 4 years during that time. Well, they really did. They balanced the budget only by taking into account all of the excess money that was going into Social Security that was moved over to the general fund. It did balance under that circumstance, but in the course of doing it, they were always borrowing money from the Social Security Trust Fund to make it balance. So we really haven't had a balanced budget in almost an entire century. That's how long it's been since we had a balanced budget. And of course, now we're operating in times where our budget deficit goes up $1 to $2 to $3 trillion a year. When I started work on this particularly hard back in 2013, I think our deficit was around $14 trillion. Only, of course, I mean, even at that point, the Social Security Trust Fund was not bankrupt, but we have since progressed to the point to where our Social Security Trust Fund is bankrupt. Every single Veterans Retirement Fund is bankrupt. When I say that, I mean that the federal government has borrowed all the money, excess money in those funds it can borrow, put into the general fund. Of course, we have outstanding debt in the way of notes and bonds to countries all over the world. China is a huge carrier of our debt. And of course, there are other countries that are, China again being the largest carrier. And we just have obligations all over the place that add up to currently over $39 trillion. There's a figure that analysts like to look at to decide just how critical is a country in debt, and how close is it coming to crashing. And it's the debt to GDP ratio. And it's generally acknowledged among, and I've had the opportunity to sit in the rooms with every single economist you've ever seen on TV. I've probably had a chance to sit in the room and talk to them personally about this. But the debt to GDP ratio is generally considered, if it's 60% debt to your GDP, ongoing GDP, then that's considered workable, livable, even if you have an unbalanced budget, as long as you keep that ratio, because your GDP typically grows every year, so your debt can essentially grow with it. It's okay, and you can maintain. Our current GDP ratio debt is somewhere in the 100 to 120% range, the highest that it's ever been. The only time it's ever been that high, the only time we got close to that high was during World War II, when, of course, we were borrowing whatever money we could borrow and doing printing at that time, literally printing whatever monies we needed to print to pay for World War II. But even after that, we again began to bring that ratio back down. It came back down. And with the turn of the century, it has skyrocketed with, unfortunately, President Bush, when he came in and the response to 9/11, we went into tremendous debt, and that debt has only continued to grow. We have a significant problem in Washington in that, one, and the founders would have told you this early on, the biggest mistake they made in the Constitution, and outside of the obvious issue they had to deal with, slavery, but the biggest fiscal issue they made in the Constitution was they did not require the government to balance its budget. They allowed Congress to borrow indefinitely, and so that is why we have the problem that we have today. So you've got that issue with Congress being able to borrow, and there was a PBS documentary that came out about 2 or 3 years ago called Unrepresented, maybe longer than that, maybe as much as 5 years ago, called Unrepresented. I actually was interviewed extensively and ended up being technical director to the documentary, dealing with the loop that we have in Washington that perpetuates this inability of Washington to get its fiscal act in order. And the loop is basically this: when you run for election, when somebody runs for election, they have to raise the money. There's what's called the money primary before you get to the actual voting primary. Who can raise the most money? So you have all the political donor class that is contributing to. We have essentially an oligarchy. An oligarchy, obviously, is where a few important, rich, typically entities, can be companies, it can be individuals, basically control your politics by their money. And in this country, in something like, I think there's 1,000 entities that contribute around 80% of all the monies that fund our political campaign. go to various corporations and individuals that are behind all that. So you start off with, you run for office and you become obligated to all of these people that are funding you, that are essentially buying you to do what they want you to do. Then you get into office, and then you have all these, again, same groups or entities, this oligarchy. You have the corporations coming in who want all of the tremendous debt breaks, they want tax breaks, they want government contracts and things of that nature. So you start off with the campaign cycle and the money that goes into campaign, which translates in Congress once you're elected into tax and your your politicos that are out there, like the lobbyists, essentially. You have that. And so how do you keep going? And then you get in there, and what are the bills they pass? They pass the bills that pay these people back for what they've given them. So you have this continuous cycle of the campaign money, the lobbyists, and then the fact that Congress has no fiscal limits on itself. It can borrow money, it can spend money as it wants for government to give back to all of these. And you have this continuous cycle. And there's nothing in that cycle to keep Congress, to limit Congress. There's no incentive for Congress to stop that. I've made, I don't know how many trips to Washington, but I always tell the story that when I leave there, I literally want to take an acid bath to get the sleeve. I mean, literally, if you walk into the bottom floor of one of the Senate office buildings, where there's a cafeteria, there's a woman at the cash register there. By God, that's her fiefdom. And you do what she tells you to do, or you get booted out. And that's where everything is in Washington. Everybody has their little fiefdoms, and they run it. And I've always said that anyone who runs for Congress, they're fine the first time. They're very idealistic the first time they run. But the second they announce for reelection, they're now subject to the political corruption, not illegal corruption, but political corruption that exists in D.C. And so that's what we have to what we're constantly dealing with. So how do you fix that? And that's what I've been working on for so long. And this is where we get to the Constitution. When our founders adopted the Constitution, they knew that it was not perfect. They knew that they did not know if they were creating a government that was going to be overbearing or a government that wouldn't be strong enough. Under the Articles of Confederation, we essentially had a treaty among 13 separate sovereigns. And in order to do something, they had no power to tax. It had no power to really even raise an army. It was just 13 countries that if they wanted to do something, they had to get together and often did in what they called convention, where they brought individuals in and they tried to negotiate how to deal with shipping or waterways or different issues at the time that would come up. We had an Articles of Confederation of Congress. Again, they didn't have much authority, and there wasn't much they could do. The states only paid taxes to the Articles government. It was voluntary. They didn't have to. There was no mechanism to enforce it. So we had a very imperfect government under the Articles of Confederation. So when the founders came together in 1787, they knew they had to create a more powerful government, but they did not want to create one that would just replace the tyranny of England that we had just separated ourselves from. So they put in all of these wonderful checks and balances, the three separate versions of government, the checks and balance that exist within the three separate departments. And then they created an important part was federalism, which is a balancing of the interests of the federal government with the states. And in the Constitution, they created a republic, not a democracy. They'll talk about a constitutional republic. That's extremely important. Every single time you say Pledge of Allegiance, you need to emphasize, and to the republic for which it stands, because that is a critical thing. A republic was created to make sure if you have a democracy, the majority rules, and eventually rules those that aren't in the majority out, and eventually grants to itself all of the blessings of the federal government, all of the freedoms. Gosh, we haven't seen that happen, have we? And so our founders, when they knew these things, they had studied this, and so they set up a republic which had this balancing of interest between the departments of our government as well as between the states and the federal government. They knew that it would have to be amended. They knew that there were changes that would have to be out. And there was a huge fight at the 1787 convention. It started out there were going to be two mechanisms for amending our Constitution. One would be in the hands of Congress, the one we know about today, where 2/3 of each House of Congress proposes an amendment. That amendment is then sent out to the states, and 3/4 of the states, 38 states, have to ratify. And that's how 27 amendments have come in, all 27 have come into existence. But there was a mechanism that they needed, that they wanted, that many of the members of the Constitutional Convention wanted the states to have a mechanism to amend the Constitution. And it got put into earlier drafts and then taken out. And then on September 8th, as they were looking at what was supposed to be the final draft of the Constitution, George Mason from Virginia, George Mason was actually wrote essentially what was the equivalent of the Bill of Rights for Virginia that ended up becoming our own Bill of Rights, transforming into that. Stood up and he said, no, we can't, I will not support this Constitution because it doesn't have a mechanism for the states to bypass Congress and propose amendments. Congress will never propose an amendment that takes power away from themselves. We may be creating a government that just becomes overbearing, that starts taking away the powers of the states, that starts taking away the power of the people, infringing upon all of them. And there needs to be a mechanism for the states to bypass Congress and propose amendments to the Constitution. That was on September 15th. And so the very last change that was made to the Constitution before it was adopted is in Article 5 of the Constitution, which is the article that governs amendments. And Article 5 says there's two mechanisms for amending the Constitution. The first is the one I just mentioned, where the Congress proposes the amendment, it goes out to the states, and the states ratify. The second mechanism that's never been used, but is there and has come very close to being used on several occasions, is a mechanism where 2/3 of the states, today that would be 34 states, if 2/3 of the states pass in their legislature what's referred to as an application, in Georgia it would be a resolution that says, we desire, under Article 5 of the Constitution, to have an amendment proposed to the Constitution. You could literally do one that says any number of amendments and leave it wide open. That's called a plenary application or an open application. But most of the time now, it's always on a specific subject. And Georgia has done this. Georgia has passed an application for a convention of states to be called under Article 5, propose a balanced budget fiscal responsibility amendment to the Constitution. They have also passed, and I was involved in all of this, they refer to me down at Capitol as the Article 5 guide. But they've asked for one for term limits for congressional officials. So that would not only include Congress, but potentially the Supreme Court, even potentially the bureaucrats, but one for term limits. And then one to limit the scope and power of the federal government, meaning let's reinterpret the Commerce Clause to mean what founders intended, not what the Supreme Court has. For example, through the commerce power, the Supreme Court has basically said that the federal government can do whatever it wants. There's very few limits on the power. Obamacare was adopted, and Justice Roberts should literally be impeached for it. His interpretation of the taxing power of the government allowed the federal government to put Obamacare on, which is and interestingly, the ability to tax has now been found unconstitutional under Obamacare. So they can't tax us, but that was the authority Justice Roberts, before that decision came down, relied upon to find Obamacare constitutional. So anyway, the third part there would be able to propose amendments that would limit the federal government back to the 17 powers that were given to it by the federal government, not Supreme Court has expanded it. So that's the mechanism that exists. Now, if we deal with about a deficit of $39 trillion. When I started this, like I said, it was in the 12 or 15. What do we do? Well, as of this point, 28 states of the 34 needed have passed applications asking or demanding that a convention of states be called for the purpose of proposing a balanced budget slash fiscal responsibility amendment to the Constitution. It has to get to 34, but that's just exclusively on that topic. In the past, you may be familiar with the 17th Amendment, for example, that allows for the direct election of senators. Well, if you go back when that back in the appointment of senators was it was a very corrupt practice. Basically, the richest guy who gave the most money to the governor was the guy who got appointed. And it became very corrupt, and the states were the people were very unhappy with that mechanism. So the process began, well, we need to let the people select the senators. I think that amendment ultimately ended up messing up the balance of federalism tremendously, but that was what the people wanted because of the corrupt practices within the states. And so Congress, the House would propose an amendment for the direct election, and they would get to the Senate, and guess what? They would pass it. All those guys were getting their pockets lined, so they would not approve. So states started this Article 5 process back in 1890. It started. And gradually, states started passing these resolutions one by one, blah, blah, blah. We got within one state of having the requisite three-fourths requirement threshold to call an Article 5 convention. And finally, the House again presented the direct election amendment to the Senate, and on their third effort, they passed it because they wanted to avoid this Article 5 convention process. It had never happened before. There's a lot of questions about it. What could happen at one of those conventions? And so they passed it, and that's how our 17th Amendment came into effect. There have been on the balanced budget, for example, we after the Carter-Reagan election, a number of states started passing resolutions for a balanced budget amendment convention for the states to propose a balanced budget amendment. Again, it would have to be ratified. And we got to within two states of calling an Article 5 convention for a balanced budget amendment. And then what happened? Congress passed the Graham-Rudman-Hollings Act, which was a law that said if we don't balance the budget in any given year, then there's an automatic cut across the board for every program to get it to the point of being able to balance. So they put that law into effect, and that kind of toned down the Article 5 movement on that subject. In the 90s, we got within one vote, again because of that movement, of Congress actually proposing there was an amendment there that was going to call for a balanced budget, and it was one swing vote, a Republican out of either Oregon or Washington senator, who at the last second changed his vote and voted against it, kept us from being able to propose a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution. The House passed by 2/3, and it missed in the Senate by one vote. So again, this Article 5 movement can thwart or has been shown to get Congress to move on a subject that they wouldn't otherwise want to do. So as I said, we have 28 applications right now. Well, in 2017, as we were working again across the country, and I've been involved, I've been legal counsel to a group called Balanced Budget Task Force, which is the group that's funded by some Patriot donors that I never got paid, by the way, just so you know. It was all volunteer. But that group that was promoting and pushing the states to pass these Article 5 resolutions, I helped them out here in Georgia. And so, so we were working with people all across the country. And in 2017, the legislature of Arizona, thinking that we were getting very close to having an Article 5 convention called for a balanced budget amendment, they called what we would call a non-Article 5 convention of states. They sent out a call. This is the way the founders did it. This is how 1787 came into existence. They sent out a call to all 50 states, invite them to Arizona, the purpose of which was to send the delegates, and we're going to write rules for a future Article 5 balanced budget amendment convention. We want to have rules in place that when that convention gets called, they've got a set of rules because people were scared that if the convention were called, that it would go outside the scope of its call. It would get called for balanced budget. The liberals were worried, well, then, yeah, but the conservatives will control the convention and they'll propose an amendment back then to ban Roe versus Wade or something like that. And then the conservatives will say, well, the liberals will, get in there and they'll get a Second Amendment repeal. So people were worried about that. So we put together a set of rules in Arizona that basically said you can't go outside the scope of the call. If you do, some one, if you're a delegate and you propose something outside the call, you get booted. And two, we won't send it to Congress to send back out for ratification. So that way we could keep anything like that from happening. So that was part of the set of rules to kind of calm down some people in some states that were worried about an Article 5 convention running away, is the term they used. So, so we did that. In 2017, when we were in Arizona, we created an entity back then referred to as the Phoenix Correspondence Commission. Now existing, it's been rebranded as the National Federalism Commission. This was a commission created by the states in a convention of states, and its purpose is to promote federalism policies and to help us, hopefully, if we get close to having an Article 5 convention, to helping Congress with scheduling that convention, and most importantly, with getting Congress to actually go back through history and figure out how many states have passed how many applications for a convention. Do they aggregate? In other words, are there enough there for 34 or for 2/3 based on when the time frame was? Did we ever reach the 2/3 mark such that a convention should be called? Essentially to audit every Article 5 application that's ever been passed at the state level going back to 1787. The first one was in 1789. New York called for an Article 5 convention back then. So they asked the National Federalism Commission, of which I serve as secretary, to do an audit. And we did an audit. We started in January 2025 using the congressional record, going back through all the state archives to pull this information. It's amazing what we were able to pull together. And what we found out was that as of 1979, all the way 1979 all the way through 2002, the threshold of 34 states for calling an Article 5 convention had been met. In fact, it got as high as 40. Now, one of the ways we got there was by counting not just applications that said we want an Article 5 convention to propose a balanced budget, but also applications that said we just want an Article 5 convention to propose any number of amendments, which should include that. Open applications is what we call it. Put the two together, we reached the threshold. Well, the reason, and all of the current constitutional scholars in the country, with maybe one exception, agree that it's appropriate to quote unquote aggregate those numbers. So we produced, and we also found out that in 2016 and 17, we reached the threshold again of 30. So we went back to Congress. We're working at the request of the House Judiciary Committee, and we went back to Congress on September 17th, Constitution Day this past year. We reported in a big press release, news conference to the Judiciary Committee that the threshold had been met and that Congress was obligated to call a convention of states for the purpose of proposing the states coming together through their delegates, working together to draft a balanced budget fiscal amendment, fiscal responsibility amendment, which would then go back to Congress. Congress would then send it back out to the states for ratification, and it would take 38 states to ratify. So that happened September 17th. Well, there's another group that's part of this that I work with, but I'm not a member of, called the Federal Fiscal Sustainability Foundation. Its head guy is David Walker, who's the former comptroller of the United States, and along with some other very significant names, has been pushing Congress to, now that we have determined that, yes, the threshold was met, has been pushing Congress to call this convention. Well, they've made a demand of Congress that if you do not call this convention within a reasonable time, which they haven't defined yet, because if you'll recall, we had the government shutdown after September 7th that kind of delayed everything. But if you don't call this convention, we're going to file suit in federal court and ask a judge to declare that the threshold was met, which would then place the burden squarely on you to call the convention. And if you don't, then potentially the states could call it themselves. We could have something close to a constitutional crisis. Whatever it is, it would certainly get to the United States Supreme Court to ultimately decide. So that's kind of what's going on right now in this area. We're waiting. We're working with Congress. We have a great relationship with the Judiciary Committee. Jody Arrington there, and got his name escapes time. The representative Jim Jordan out of Ohio, working very closely with them. And Jody Arrington is just flat out on the floor of Congress said, we need to call this convention. We're obligated to do it. We need to call it. So anyway, if there ever was an Article 5 convention actually called, it would be the biggest political event you've ever seen in your lifetime. It would be huge because it's never happened before, and it would be under the Constitution. And there'd be all these people, all the liberal side of it would be saying, oh my God, they're calling a constitutional convention. It is not a constitutional convention. It is an Article 5 convention for the limited purpose of proposing a balanced budget fiscal responsibility. I have already drafted and we've provided to Congress call that they need to issue to call this convention. But the liberals would call it a constitutional convention. Oh, the conservatives are going to get there because the conservatives will control the convention because each state, it's a one state, one vote. That's the way the voting works. And so there's more conservative controlled states than liberals. So they would technically control the convention. But it would, again, be limited, and there'd be no purpose. I mean, part of the call that I drafted for Congress specifically states, if you propose anything other than a fiscal responsibility amendment, we're not going to send it back out to the states for ratification. We'll consider that merely. So we've got all the steps in place to do this and do it safely. That's what's going to be coming up. And as I said, this would be huge. This would be the equivalent of the Olympics coming to Atlanta. Because what you're going to have is you're going to have delegates from all 50 states show up at a convention center, and they're going to spend the first 2 or 3 weeks talking to the experts about what's the best kind of fiscal responsibility amendment that we need, doing that, going through, educating themselves, then coming together, much like our founders did, and doing drafts of the amendment, that then come out for debate. And this will be followed on whatever it is, C-SPAN that does all that. It'll be daily fall. And I hope that they have such a convention, they'll let me be secretary. Secretary is the best job because you have control over what happened at the record of what happened at the convention, which we have found from the 1787 convention is the thing you want to have control over. So anyway, that is in the works. We will see what happens. I think it will almost certainly have to be a lawsuit will have to be filed. We're encouraging all the attorney generals in all the states to step up. We've already drafted the complaint. We had a constitutional law firm in in Washington drafted for us. We've already drafted it. And we're hoping one of the attorney generals will step forward and do it. We have multiple states that have said, we will join, but we don't want to be the first. So we've got a bunch of scaredy cats out there, probably over half a dozen at least. Unfortunately, Chris Carr is he's of the other side. He's unapproachable on this. It's very disappointing that he can't see the need for this and the safety of it. So we're hoping that whoever gets elected Attorney General is coming forward. And I will tell you right now, Bill Cowsert is the brother-in-law of Steve Kemp. Not Steve, Brian Kemp, and he's Brian and Bill are married to sisters. Brian, and Bill, they're married to sisters. So anyway, Bill is a senator out of Athens. And he's running, and I totally support him, and I hope y'all will as well, because he'll file on his own. Bill knows this stuff. He and I worked together on all of this stuff going back to 2014 in Georgia. So anyway, that's what we've got going on. I have brought with me today 3 different periodicals. They've got a little bit of age on them now. One, the bigger one, is an article I wrote that just talks about this Article 5 movement, the different groups that are involved. It's changed a little bit since that was written. I think that's almost 10 years old now. Most of the main groups are referenced in there, and the whole process of Article 5 and what it's about can explain that to you. And then two other books, one that I did for U.S. term limits, one that I did for the Balanced Budget Amendment Task Force. They're both very much the same. But there are some conservative groups that strongly oppose an Article 5 convention. For example, the John Birch Society very strongly opposes it. It has the first two presidents of the John Birch Society supported Article 5, and then it changed after they left. Larry McDonald, our congressman, was the second president of the John Birch Society. He supported it, and then it changed. And from my standpoint, it's become a just a fundraising uh, mechanism for them to scare people and try to get money. The two booklets on either side of the main one there explain why an Article 5 convention could never run away. The thing that the John Birch Society says gives you all the reasons why it could. So if you want to educate yourself, feel free to. I got those stacked up in my office with my do to them. So I just can't bear to throw them away. So you're welcome to take one of those too. So with that, that's kind of where we're at. I encourage you every chance you get, if you see one of your legislators, to encourage them to, one, support the National Federalism Commission. I ask for a small contribution in the form of dues past legislative session. We've been doing this since 2017 and have never asked for a penny. The states support us. We don't need a lot of money. Almost every one of we have a staff of about 12 people, and they're almost all volunteers. But I asked Georgia to give us a small funding amount, and they somehow just left it out of the budget. So I'm a little pissed off at them right now. But encourage them to support Gold. Just tell them support whatever it is Guldenschuh's selling it. That national commission. Would y'all please support that? Y'all screwed up. And then we don't have anything here in Georgia currently pending. We will have some more legislation that goes out in 2027. It's going out to all the states. It's called the Compact, which is to, again, essentially put into law in a majority of states what the rules for a convention would be. So once again, this possibility of a runaway convention goes away. For all the reasons in these books, there's a 0% chance of it ever happening. But you still have to deal with it because, as we know in this community, we have people who lash out and accuse all government officials of corruption, not always having the basis for it, having been on the end of that. And so the accusations get made, they need to respond to that. Those books respond. So with that, I'll open it up for any questions. Yes, sir. By the way, thank you. You have been incredibly attentive. Thank you.
Sure.
I said you have been incredibly attentive. Thank you very much.
This all sounds like the same kind of argument that's going on about NATO right now.
Well, I'm not familiar with, I'm not sure I understand what the NATO argument is. Fill me in what you mean by that.
Well, that is the U.S. government, is concerned because NATO is not helping us out in the areas where you would think that they should help us out.
Right, like the Strait of Hormuz, right.
And so it's a question about whether we want to stay in NATO or just let it go. Do you have any information about that?
About that particular issue, no, I mean, now you're asking me really about something off subject, but it has to do with Trump. I think we've never had a president like Trump who, again, was used to business deals, used to negotiating, and has negotiated in foreign policy the way he has. I don't know that it's ever happened. It's certainly not happened in my lifetime with any leader in the world. And I think that's just part of his overall strategy. Well, if you're not going to support us, by God, you can get your oil. Good luck, get your oil. And I think in the short run, that's a great strategy. Whether you want to do that over years or not, even over months, I don't know. But I think in the short run, that's a great strategy. Yes, sir. It's the word post ratifying. The best example of it is the birthright citizenship argument that we just had a few days ago. That's the 14th Amendment, which has a provision that all people born in the United States, and then the language is, and subject to the jurisdiction thereof, are citizens. And so the issue then becomes, well, what does that language mean? So you have the Supreme Court interpreting that language, and based on the questions, it sounds like they're going to get it wrong.
Tribal lands, 1920s, they've already done work. sure that it's very clear who falls under that jurisdiction. Does
Right.
That's very interesting to see how they find it this
Well,
way.
if you go back to again the debates over the 14th Amendment, there's no question that that portion of the 14th Amendment was intended to ensure that all slaves and their families here in the United States were viewed as citizens of the United States. That was, if you go into the debates over the 14th Amendment and some of the discussions that occurred on the floor of Congress, there were two different times the question was asked, what does subject to the jurisdiction thereof mean? And two different proposers of the 14th Amendment, people who had supported it, stated that if they, I'm parsing their word, but they basically said it meant that you're here legally and that you're domiciled here in the country, which means you're here legally. Okay. And that was the argument that the Solicitor General made, again, just a couple of days ago, that the line that you draw is based on, are they domiciled here? They're domiciled here if they're here legally. They're domiciled here if they are, if they have a green card. So now you're here legally. If your parents have a green card, if you're born, then that's legal. That was the case from 1898 that everyone was citing to the court. And so those are the facts. If you're on a visa, you're here legally, but you're not domiciled. A visa in and of itself says you're here temporarily. So that would not apply. And that was the line they wanted to draw. And some of the unfortunately moderately conservative Supreme Court justices were uncomfortable, seemed to be uncomfortable with that line, which again, if you go back to what they said at the time they passed the amendment, at the time they proposed, that's what they said. So, I mean, that should be the end of the question in Guldenschuh's simple constitutional theory. Apparently, it's not to them.
Whatever gets passed, it's still no matter how.
Yeah, it's going to get challenged no matter what. Everything's going to get challenged.
We are.
Well, it will get challenged. The question becomes, and at this point, if it were called based on the audit that the National Federalism Commission did, it would absolutely be challenged, because the question would become, how do you aggregate applications? Do you put an application that's wide open together with an application that's specific? That's never been resolved. If you look at provide, it places very little discretion in Congress under that second provision. Everything that Congress has to do in that provision, the bypass provision that we're talking about, gives Congress very little discretion. So it would seem to defeat the purpose of the amendment to give Congress the discretion wildly to say, oh, we're not going to count those 10. Or the constitutional scholars of today, again, with very limited exception, believe that it's perfectly appropriate to aggregate those two, because all the parties are saying we want a convention under Article 5 for many purposes, for limited purposes. So your convention would be called for the narrow list of those purposes. And that's perfectly appropriate to do. But that's never been resolved. That's an issue that the Supreme Court would have to resolve should we ever call a convention using as things are being counted today.
Hey,
Yes.
David, you've met with these top economists all over America. Do they have a consensus of, hey, once the debt reaches this point, we're done, there's no more America?
Jeff, you and I think alike with so much, because back in 2015, when Chicken Little was crying, at the end, I asked him then, okay, when are we going to reach that point? And we have far past what they thought was the point we could continue. We have far past it now. You only have history to go on, and history would say, again, just as they thought back in 2015, that we're already very, very, very close to that by virtue of that debt to GDP ratio. I could tell you a couple of things that, in my mind, based on my studies, if we go to electronic money, we're real close, because that means that's one of the few tools left to continue to bear the burden of this tremendous without default. It's one of the few tools left that you can use to kind of get around payday eventually. So I think if that happens, then I think think we're really close to going into a major depression, not recession, depression. But I mean, it ultimately happens when I mean, we're already at the point where interest on the debt now is higher than our defense budget, which is the second highest appropriation in our budget, the highest being Social Security, Medicare. Oh, yeah, shoot, the highest being Medicare, Social Security. Well, the two of them. And projections are we'll surpass that. Now, Social Security, there's a law in place for Social Security that says once the money's coming in equal the outflow, once that happens, even though all that money is going into the general budget, they still keep track of how much is coming in. And when that amount exceeds the amount, Social Security has a bunch of IOUs in their fund, their trust fund. Once that trust fund becomes zero because the money going out, which is already the case, is more than the money coming in. Once that reaches finally a zero number on paper, it's already zero, but a zero number on paper, then Social Security benefits under the law, as it currently exists, must be reduced percentage-wise by what it takes to keep that equal. So they're looking at 2020. I mean, they're looking in the next, 7 to 10 years of a 20% cut in Social Security benefits. Is Congress going to let that happen? They're going to come up with some law that extends it. They're going to have to deal with Social Security. Question becomes, will they deal with it in the likely way they'll deal with it, which is where they all get together and say, let's spend some more money and go into more debt and not deal with the real issues, or whether they deal with it like they did. When was it? Was it under the Reagan administration? When was it that they made some real changes to Social Security to they changed some of the age limits, and they started making it taxable at a certain area, a certain limit, to really deal with the problem. So the answer is I don't know when that number is. I've asked it many times. I've never got a straight answer. Well, the answer I've got has now been surpassed. But the things that I think the Social Security crisis will ultimately become a crisis across the board for our debt. And then I think, and that's coming. That's on its way. We know that there is a finite time for that. I think it's somewhere in the 7-year range, I want to say. And then the other thing is if we monetize money, go strictly to electronic money, I think that's a really negative thing for the country.
Wow. It's got 7 years left. All right.
Briefly, they said each state gets one vote.
Yes, sir.
Mechanically, how would that's operate?
Well, I mean,
It was how many?
yeah, we've had pre-1787, we were having about one convention in states every year. And when Congress put the convention proposed amendments, but the Article 5 says, when they put that into Article 5, they were referring to the process that they had used almost every year up to that point between 1776 and 1787. So what was a convention like? Again, a convention then, which is what we would expect it to be now, the states can nominate any number of delegates to go to the convention. 2017, Georgia named 5 of us, 3 of us went. But we only get one vote, just the voters won. Because it is just like, for example, I don't want to go, that's not a good example. But it's kind of like NATO. When you have all these countries come together for NATO, they're equal sovereigns, even though the United States is slower to make it. It only gets one vote. And the way we've always treated conventions among the states is it is a meeting of equal sovereigns, and therefore each state gets one vote. So that delegation has got to cast its vote. And if there's 2 people there and they're broke 1-1, then their vote is a pass. Their vote is no vote. Otherwise, it'll be either a yay or a nay based on whatever the resolution is. Yes, sir.
It's the issue of statehood or Puerto Rico or the District of Columbia. How is that thing turning out? Seems like those who are eager to change things want those 2 states created, and those who are more conservative are resisting that. How do you see that working out?
If the government goes back to all controlled on the Democrat side, meaning the House, the Senate, and the President, then they could pass legislation to let those 3 states out. And I think they probably, as woke as we've got, they probably would. I mean, yeah, they've talked about it before. You had some people like guy out of West Virginia, the senator out of just West Virginia, who just said, "No, I'm not going to go there." That was when it was like 51-49. They needed his vote, mansion. But yeah, if they got a big enough majority, it only takes the majority to break it, and they'll do it because it'll give them 60. Take DC and take DC and Puerto Rico. Then there's one other. I don't know if it's I don't know who it is. It's another one of our territories. That's 6 senators, all of whom those entities all vote liberals.
Can't let that happen. All right. Let's eat, y'all. Let's get a thing to run.